In Springfield, they're eating the dogs, the people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.
Illiberalism is in fashion. Across the world, its proponents are declaring their presence, repeating loud expressions of exasperation at the worn-out shibboleths of liberal democracy, plastering fantasy slogans on the side of red buses, setting up TV channels and web platforms that will make no concessions to such outmoded notions as fact-checking, and conveying, whenever they have a chance, a deep, insecure sense that a strong us can only ever emerge out of an excluded them. This is the sound of illiberalism ascendant.
Britain, my friends, is under siege. Not from bombs or foreign armies, and not just from those fighting-age men crossing the English Channel. On Wednesday, His Majesty's government announced it would halve tax relief for repairs to Britain's historic churches, leaving nearly 1,000 at immediate risk of closure. There aren't just old buildings that represent our churches, they're the soul of our country. This is nothing more than a lefty assault on, well, our faith and indeed our farms too. It's happening across the piece. A favourite of mine, St Bartholomew's the Great in London, has stood for over 900 years. It survived the Great Fire of London and the Nazi Blitz. But here's the real question. Will it survive Labour? The left's grand strategy is pretty simple. Dismantle our heritage, erase our shared culture, and leave us rootless in this warped, dystopian future they're seeking to build. These buildings, which have given our country so very much, are being left to crumble. Some of them are being turned into mosques or something else.
Oh dear, that was GB News, a British TV channel which somehow always makes me think of the wartime broadcasts of Lord Haw-Haw. And this is GB News as well.
Today we're digging into a revelation that has sent shockwaves through the heart of our capital city and indeed the nation. According to a recent report, 1 in every 12 people living in London is now believed to be an illegal migrant. This staggering statistic not only highlights the scale of the immigration crisis we face, but also raises serious questions about the effectiveness of our border control and immigration policies.
What once seemed like maverick voices from the margins casting disdain upon liberal norms like the rule of law, freedom of journalists to hold power to account, independence of the judiciary, cultural rights of minorities and the inviolability of electoral outcomes, are now serious challenges to what we once took to be the foundational norms of democracy. From Viktor Orban in Hungary, an explicit advocate of illiberalism, to Donald Trump in the White House, more an instinctive illiberal than anything philosophically pin-downable. From the German AfD to Milei in Argentina. What we are seeing is a stridently confident movement of political leaders and commentators for whom the old rules of democratic politics have become disposable. Of particular interest to us on The Sound of Politics is the extensive rejection of speech norms that have characteristically stood for liberal democratic discourse. 3 in particular. Firstly, the principle of civility towards opponents. It's fine to say that the other side is wrong. Indeed, politics is defined by such explicit agonism. But it has traditionally not been fine to deny that the other side has nothing to say that is worth hearing, to seek to silence or ridicule or intimidate them, to substitute insult for argument. Secondly, the principle of sensitivity towards the feelings of others, especially those least able or likely to exercise their own voices, perhaps because of structural disadvantages. This doesn't mean that individuals and groups may not be criticised or that political argument should lack vigour. It just means that the discourse of political bullying is not okay. Thirdly, the principle of truth-telling. Of course, truth is contested, especially at the level of nuanced interpretation. But the intentional fabrication of falsehoods, suppression of evidence, efforts to bamboozle and manipulate, and refusals to acknowledge counter-evidence are politically and culturally corrosive, however worthy the motives for adopting such strategies might seem to be. So these three liberal principles, civility, sensitivity and truth-telling, are under assault by political communicators who regard them as being somehow restrictive, outdated, and impediments to more Machiavellian political ends. And so the sound of politics begins to sound less like a debate of ideas and more like a brawl between intellectual bruisers. Now, for that to happen, the media through which most political communication takes place have either to open up discursive space to accommodate an increasingly illiberal political tone, or they have to somehow take a stand against it. But they can't do both at the same time. I'm interested in how serious organisations responsible for public news and discussion are responding to this challenge, and I hope to be speaking to some of them in future episodes. In the meantime, to help us think more deeply about this question, I'm delighted to have as my guest Professor Lance Bennett from the University of Washington in Seattle. He's not only a leading global scholar of political communication, but he's co-author of an article in the European Journal of Communication entitled Communication and Democratic Erosion, the Rise of Illiberal Public Spheres. Well, Lance, it's really good to have you here. You've argued persuasively that the ascendancy of illiberalism depends upon a particular kind of communication system. Could you outline the characteristics of that illiberal communication system in contrast to the characteristics of a more conventionally liberal public communication system?
Sure. Let's start with the liberal side because I think that's more familiar with people. You can trace our sort of liberal democratic values and cultures and communications with all the varieties that exist back to Enlightenment principles. And, the Enlightenment involved a range of really revolutionary ideas at the time of mutual recognition of people who are interacting in the political realm. That becomes tremendously important because if you're not recognized to speak, you don't exist politically. And tolerance for different opinions. Of course, politics involves conflict, and so some tolerance for opposing and different views is required to have some kind of a democratic resolution. And of course, there's background factors such as trust in the institutions that broker those kinds of conflict resolutions. There's the idea that we would have a reasoned exchange. I mean, this, of course, is a ideal verging on fantasy, but nonetheless, ideals have a place, I think, in our thinking about things. Mm-hmm. So the idea that you would have a reasoned exchange leading to either a conclusion in which one or all parties change their views, or an acceptance of differences that may be persisting depending on how a conflict is resolved. And then the principle of inclusion becomes, I think, the sort of invisible hand of liberal democratic culture. Even though no democracy has included everyone equally, that's another ideal that verges on fantasy, particularly these days. The idea of inclusion as a goal has made it possible for groups that have not been recognized and not been heard to form social movements or go to court or use other means politically to gain recognition and inclusion in the political process. So if you run down that list, what you find is that illiberal communication violates all of those fundamental democratic cultural principles. Starting with the back of the list, the idea of inclusion has been theorized in communication and public opinion circles as the idea that there are counter-publics who are not fully included in the general public, and counter-publics press for inclusion in various ways, winning rights, representation, and so on. The illiberal version of that is what I would call transgressive communication that aims to attack and exclude those counter-publics, not give them access to courts or public forums for voicing their views. And you see that going on in many democracies today. You know, the attacks on gender and sexual minorities, the attacks on religious minorities, attacks on ethnic minorities in many different democracies in different ways. And then the discourses that follow from the exclusion of counter-publics or minorities in our political forums involve failure to recognize, involve demeaning communication that is, uncivil and that calls people by stereotypes and names. Donald Trump is the master of calling people names or not recognizing them in really fundamental ways. During the campaign, he feigned surprise to hear that Kamala Harris was Black, and which undermines her entire public identity in a kind of a profound way, which I think was gleeful entertainment for his voters, but strangely disruptive to Kamala Harris's presentation of her political self. So all of these standards of liberal communication are really being reacted against in almost mirror opposite ways by illiberal communicators who may or may not be trending toward authoritarianism in one form or another as a result of this transformative communication.
Yeah. What is it, Lance, that makes this illiberal style resonant, perhaps appealing in some way to so many people? And sort of as a supplement to that question, how much do we actually know about which people it appeals to and which it doesn't?
Two questions that are, I think, fundamental to understanding the rise of the far right in so many democracies today, including the looming threat in yours. And I think that what's appealing is that increasingly the political discourses of democratic election campaigns, of public policy debates, have become, as our dear departed colleague Jay Blumler said, marketed and managed and scripted in ways that a lot of voters simply don't find credible or authentic. And I think who those voters are is quite telling. I mean, for one thing, the great divide seems to be one of education, and related to education, we could call it class, although class is a rather fuzzy concept these days. But certainly the U.S. divide over the election of Donald Trump was very clearly an educational divide, with college-educated voters voting for Harris and high school or below voters voting for Trump. And this is a really a stark reversal of patterns from 50 years ago, in which the reverse tended to be true. Of course, there were fewer college-educated 50 years ago than there are today. But that divide is quite pronounced, and so people feel left out of the public conversation. And then along comes someone like Farage or someone like Trump or Alice Weidel in Germany, and they begin talking to the people who feel they have not been addressed in meaningful terms. And the nature of the talk, however, is horrendously disruptive for our public conversations.
But isn't that, at one level, grounds for a certain kind of optimism? By which I mean, if it's the failure of liberal democratic conversation, the failure of politics to be imaginative, creative, to create resonance, then if that failure can be addressed, one might hope that this tendency, this trend towards illiberalism could cease. It's not as if there is some sort of natural human appetite for it which makes liberalism somehow inherently repulsive to people.
Well, but that's an interesting question on its own, it seems to me, because if you look at the trends across Europe in particular, what you find is that liberalism was kind of imposed in a Trojan horse mechanism called neoliberalism, which is a serious corruption of Adam Smith's vision of a society and its various participants. Not that Adam Smith should be terribly relevant today, but they have corrupted him to the point where he's actually been introduced to people as the problem, as you know, it's the gross individualization of society. It is everybody having to fend for themselves, and the punchline in that discourse is, oh, and by the way, you white men who were once regarded as high status just for being a white male are now being challenged in terms of status and respect by a rainbow, a spectrum of others in society, and more are coming in all the time.
Yeah.
So that you get these connections between the corrupted version of liberalism, which is kind of being blamed for the loss of community and solidarity in societies. And do we have the solution? Yes, we do. The solution is to stop immigration, to declare the supremacy of a particular religion, Christianity broadly conceived here, Hinduism broadly conceived in India, and so on. And we will restore community by the sheer force of symbolism.
It's been said that populism works well as an oppositional movement, but it doesn't have that much to offer once it's in power. Its script is much more interesting at the level of resistance and at the level of radical change. Is that the same with illiberalism? I mean, does it only really work as a resistant discourse?
Well, that's, to me, an excellent empirical question, the answer to which is not entirely clear. But let me take a case or two and play them out through this question. I mean, one thing that occurs to me is that Hungary turns out to have declared itself, Viktor Orban declared Hungary an illiberal state, illiberal democracy. So what does that mean? Well, it means, among other things, that there are attacks on civil society. The George Soros as the archenemy of civil society and democracies is just one example. There are pressures in universities to teach in certain ways, to honor the kind of Western civilization tradition over the post-colonial tradition. In fact, in cases such as Florida in the United States, 2 universities in Florida, public universities, have been taken over politically by the governor, and the boards of governors are now actively intervening in tenure cases, curriculum decisions, and prohibiting the teaching of certain topics. So back to Hungary, then you look at the media. And the media system in Hungary is now a strange oligarchical beast that is essentially owned by friends of Viktor Orban. So the media system makes it very hard for other viewpoints to be heard. And the interesting thing is that the propaganda still echoes those earlier claims from the populist rise of Orban in its reporting and framing of news stories. And then you flip to the US and you see, well, now we are beginning to pressure the media. The Washington Post is a special case because it's owned by Jeff Bezos. who wants Trump to favor his space programs and not impose tariffs on his international business interests and so on. But all of the papers in the US now, the mainstream papers, including the New York Times, are beginning to normalize the policy actions of the Trump administration. I mean, we're having serious debates about taking over Greenland in this country. Serious debates. I mean, I don't take it seriously, but the New York Times does. So I think that when populism becomes rooted in an illiberal communication structure that then begins to encroach on institutions through elections by electing politicians who can actually do things and not just talk about them, and on and on. So I'm not so sure that populism lacks an agenda. If you look at what Meloni is doing in Italy, she has an agenda. I mean, those agendas are interestingly tempered by EU membership, so we don't have a controlled experiment to be able to look at what would Italy be like if it were not a member of the EU? What would Hungary look like if it were not a member of the EU? Is illiberalism simply a way station on the road to authoritarianism? That's an interesting question, but it's a very tricky one to try and research.
No, absolutely. I mean, I suppose a counterexample is Poland, where we do have an interesting moment of populism losing the battle, and at least for the time being, and a return to something much more visibly liberal. And that really brings me to my next question, which is, are there certain national cultures that are more prone to illiberalism than others? I mean, what do we know, or what should we know comparatively?
Well, at the risk of oversimplifying, it seems to me that one cluster of nations could be labeled the sort of post-Soviet cluster of democracies that never fully stabilized as democracies and had a backdrop of authoritarianism and very regimented communications, which also happened to be clear and emotionally effective. I mean, you know, a huge question is, how has Putin maintained his so-called popularity given what he has done after transitioning through what he called managed democracy 15 or so years ago, which is very similar to Orban's illiberal democracy. And Putin went full on dictator with an electoral fig leaf attached. So I think that you know, in these cases, you see that democracies that were never fully established, you know, in measurable terms, are much more likely to succumb to illiberalism and then gradual convergence on what I think Hungary is now termed by the VDEM project in Gothenburg, which studies world democracies, both historically and contemporary, as an electoral autocracy, which would, if it were not such an abstract and unpleasant term, probably grate against the EU leadership that is trying to keep up the pretense that, no, they're really a democracy.
Could public service broadcasting be a significant variable in that kind of comparative analysis?
Yeah, but the dilemma of public service broadcasting is that it's state funded, and therefore it can be politically manipulated, as you know well from the past history of the BBC and the Tony Blair and so on and so forth. So that public broadcasting everywhere in the democracies is under attack. The first wave of the attack was from the Rupert Murdochs of the world, who didn't want the competition, who didn't want competition for high quality news. And then the second wave of the attack is from politicians who don't want to have anyone commenting on their spoken truths, no matter how outrageous the lies that come forth might be. I'm surprised that they have not already announced the death of public broadcasting in the US, which was always a very weak system compared to almost any Western European or UK system. So yeah, public broadcasting could be an important firewall against the destructive communication practices that have invaded even what we call news in many countries now. So, but I see public broadcasting as being still strong in countries where democracy is still strong. by those VDEM measures. So Norway is great. I mean, Norway is off the charts in terms of democracy and social harmony, but they are also a country that has had very little immigration, that has had great wealth, that has been well shared.
Yeah.
So, gee, if you could do that for every democracy on the planet, you would probably solve the problem of populism in the far right.
That might have more to do with oil than public service broadcasting.
Yeah, my Norwegian colleagues are always bragging about the number one rating of Norwegian democracy. And I say, well, but you're a unicorn.
Yeah. Let me ask a concluding question, the normative question, if you like. What should we do about it all? The left, the liberal centre as well, seem to be in a state of sort of numbed shock about just how quickly and how badly things have gone and the depth of it. And certainly one speaks to people who say they just didn't imagine in their lifetime some of the things that we are now finding ourselves having to talk about being talked about. Are there strategies of opposition to illiberalism, particularly that those of us interested in the communication of politics should be pursuing?
Let me approach that in two levels. One is political parties. I mean, the center-left parties around the democracies are crumbling. I mean, if you look at Germany and the sad case of Olaf Scholz, that party seems to not understand why it is losing voters. I mean, literally, I have colleagues and friends in the Social Democrats in Germany, and they seem puzzled, just deeply puzzled, and of course worried because they're tanking. But the Democrats in the US have not issued the only person with a loud public voice that issued any response toward Trump's blanket aggressions, transgressions of so many different norms and laws. I mean, he's violated laws, was a minister, a woman who spoke a sermon during his inaugural that asked him to be kind and to respect democratic principles, which he dismissed immediately. But the Democrats, no. The Democrats have said nothing because they're not really a viable political organization any longer. And we'll see how much longer the Labour Party in the UK can present itself as a viable political organization after inheriting the legacy of a catastrophe on the part of the Tories, right? So it's not that their great ideas mobilized so many voters. It was the only alternative to the disaster that the country was facing. So I think that the political parties need to regroup, and that's easier said than done, of course. In the US, one of the underlying problems that has created this massive split. It's almost a 50-50 split between the MAGA Republicans and the rest of the country that scatter over various kinds of affiliations. But the disaster here is that basically the party cannot address the issues that are disturbing the voters because Wall Street funds so much of the party that it cannot speak about certain issues. So how do you fix that? That's an excellent question. Little anecdote. During the Occupy Wall Street movements of a dozen years ago, then President Obama had a fundraiser on Wall Street, and Occupy Wall Street occupied Obama and demanded that he address inequality, which he had actually been talking about in response partly to this mass movement. But after he left the bankers' meeting, he never spoke of inequality again in that campaign. So there are things that are simply prohibited, and those things would change the voter and the public understanding of the differences between the parties. Yeah. Right now, if you ask most Americans, I'm confident you would hear that there's no difference between these parties, which I look at with horror as a public response, and yet it is probably the modal response among voters. The other side of the coin is social movements, which nicely sync up and feed into right-wing parties in Europe and in this country. But the left is scattered across hundreds of identity movements, issue movements, factions of those issue and identity movements that are internally roiling in their own issues and discourses around who are we and what are we going to do, meanwhile not being able to connect up in any kind of a common response, much less feed into political parties on the left, of which there are precious few, because the political culture of the so-called far left is a very direct democracy, participatory, non-hierarchical organization culture. So political parties don't fit well with that, but they fit great on the right. So I hate to end because you opened with such an optimistic statement, and now I'm saying, here are the problems, but they look like they're kind of intractable.
Well, Lance, I would say that I feel more miserable at the end of speaking to you than I did at the beginning. However, I feel a lot more enlightened. I really enjoyed it. I think you've put your analysis in front of us in a tremendously eloquent form.
Thank you. This has been a very interesting conversation. It's good to see you, Stephen.
In Springfield, they're eating the dogs. The people that came in, they're eating the cats.
You turn if you want to. The ladies not for turning.
From this evening, I must give the British people a very simple instruction. You must stay at home.
Madam Speaker, there's one very big difference. I lead my party, he follows his.
The Sound of Politics with Professor Stephen Coleman.